Hey everybody! In November of 2023, I was able to visit the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden with some friends of mine. Admission was about $17 US. I took about 10 minutes of footage of the ship, which I'm sharing here, as well as a brief history of the Vasa. The Vasa is a Swedish warship built between the years 1626 and 1628. The ship sank after sailing roughly 1,400 yards into her maiden voyage in the Stockholm harbor on August 10, 1628. She fell into obscurity after most of her valuable bronze cannons were salvaged in the 17th century, until she was located again in the 1950s in a busy shipping area. The ship was salvaged with a largely intact hull in 1961. She was housed in a temporary museum called the Vasa Varvet until 1988 and was then moved permanently into the Vasa Museum in the Royal National City Park in Stockholm. This ship is one of Sweden's most popular tourist attractions and has been seen by over 35 million visitors since 1961. Since her recovery, the Vasa has become a widely recognized symbol of the Swedish Empire. In the beginning of the 17th century, Sweden was a sparsely populated, poor, and peripheral northern European kingdom of little influence. But in the 1620s, Sweden was on its way to becoming one of the major powers in continental politics. This rise to prominence in international affairs and increasing military prowess was made possible by a succession of able monarchs and the establishment of a powerful centralized government supporting a highly efficient military organization. Swedish historians have described this as one of the more extreme examples of an early modern state using almost all of its available resources to wage war, and the small northern kingdom transformed itself into a fiscal military state and one of the most militarized states in history. Gustavus Adolphus, who reigned from 1611 to 1632, has been considered one of the most successful Swedish kings in terms of success in warfare. When the Vasa was built, he had been in power for more than a decade. Sweden was embroiled in a war with Poland-Lithuania, which had been raging since 1618 and had thus far not been successful. The king's plans for a Polish campaign and for securing Sweden's interest required a strong naval presence in the Baltic Sea. The Swedish Navy suffered severe setbacks during the 1620s, with multiple ships running aground or being outmaneuvered, defeated, or even lost. The Swedish admiral's flagship had been captured by the Poles, and another ship was blown up by her own crew when she was boarded and nearly captured by the Poles. Up until the 17th century, the Swedish Navy was composed primarily of small or medium-sized ships with a single gun deck, normally armed with 12-pound or smaller cannons. These ships were cheaper than larger ships and were well suited for escort and patrol. They also suited the prevailing tactical thinking within the Navy, which emphasized boarding the enemy warship as the decisive moment in a naval battle rather than gunnery. The king, who was a keen artillerist, saw the potential of ships as gun platforms, and large, heavily armed ships made a more dramatic statement in the political theater of naval power. Beginning with the Vasa, he ordered a series of ships with 2 full gun decks, outfitted with much heavier guns, which had never been done before. The Vasa was constructed at the Navy Yard in Stockholm under a contract with private entrepreneurs in 1626 to 1627 and armed primarily with bronze cannons cast in Stockholm specifically for the ship. The king had ordered 72 24-pound guns for the ship, which was too many to fit on any single deck. The Vasa is an early example of a warship with 2 full gun decks, and it was built when the theoretical principles of shipbuilding were still poorly understood. There is no evidence that the ship's designer had ever built a ship like this before, and the 2 gun decks presented a complicated compromise between seaworthiness and firepower. Combined with the fact that 17th century warships were built with intentionally high superstructures to be used as firing platforms, the Vasa was a risky undertaking. Laser measurements of the Vasa's structure conducted in 2007 through 2011 confirmed that the center of gravity was way too high. Richly decorated as a symbol of the king's ambitions for Sweden and for himself, Upon completion, the Vasa was one of the most powerfully armed vessels in the world. However, she was dangerously unstable with too much weight in the upper structure of the hull. A stability test conducted in the summer of 1628 was cut short when the admiral responsible for supervising construction feared the ship would capsize. The ship's master expressed his concern and wishing that the king, who was away in battle in Poland, were present in Stockholm to determine if the ship was battle-ready or not. King Adolphus had been sending a steady stream of letters home, impatient and insisting that the ship be put to sea as soon as possible. The king's subordinates lacked the political courage to openly discuss the ship's problems or suggest the maiden voyage be postponed. Despite the many misgivings over the apparent lack of stability, the Vasa was ordered to sea. The maiden voyage was set for August 10, 1628. The day was calm, and the only wind was a light breeze from the southeast. The ship was hauled by anchor along the eastern waterfront of the city to the southern side of the harbor, where 4 sails were set. The gun ports were opened, and the guns were set out to fire a salute as the ship left Stockholm. As the Vasa passed under the bluffs to the south, a gust of wind filled her sails, and she headed suddenly to port. The sheets were cast off, and the ship slowly righted herself as the gust passed. Then an even stronger gust again forces the ship to her port side, this time pushing the open lower gun port under the surface, allowing water to rush into the lower gun deck. The water building up in the gun deck quickly exceeded the ship's minimal righting ability, and the water continued to pour in until it ran down into the hold. Many nearby boats rushed to aid, but despite these efforts and the short distance to land, 30 people reportedly perished as the ship went under, in full view of a crowd of thousands of spectators, including foreign ambassadors and spies of the king's allies and enemies. News reached the king of the loss over 2 weeks later. "Imprudence and negligence must have been the cause," he wrote angrily, demanding in no uncertain terms that the guilty parties be punished. The ship's captain survived the disaster and was immediately taken in for questioning, where he swore that the guns had been properly secured and the entire crew was sober. A full inquest took place at the Royal Palace on September 5, 1628. Each of the surviving officers was questioned, as was the supervising shipwright and a number of expert witnesses. The object of the inquest was as much or more to find a scapegoat as to find out why the ship had sank. Surviving crew members were questioned one by one about the handling of the ship at the time, with the understanding that whoever the committee might find guilty for the fiasco would face a severe penalty. Crewmen and contractors formed 2 camps. Each tried to blame the other, and everyone swore he had done his duty without fail. During the inquest, the details of the stability demonstration were revealed. In the end, no guilty party could be found. The king himself had approved all the measurements and armaments, and the ship was built exactly according to the instructions and loaded with the number of guns specified. The earliest attempts at raising the Vasa resulted in successfully righting the ship underwater, but also got her more severely stuck in the mud, which later became one of the biggest impediments to the earliest attempts at recovery. Salvaging technology in the 17th century was much more primitive than today, but the recovery of ships used roughly the same principles as were used to raise the Vasa more than 300 years later. 2 ships were placed parallel to either side above the wreck, and ropes were attached to anchors that were sent down and hooked to the ship. The 2 ships were then filled with as much water as was safe, the ropes were tightened, and the water was then pumped out. The sunken ship then rose with the ships on the surface and could be towed to shallower waters. This process was then repeated until the entire ship had successfully raised above water level. Even though the underwater weight of the Vasa was not that great, the mud in which she had settled made her sit more securely on the bottom and required considerable lifting power to overcome. In April of 1961, the Vasa returned to the surface for the first time in 333 years. Thousands of artifacts and the remains of at least 15 of the 30 people who did not survive the capsize were recovered in the Vasa's hull. Among the many items found were clothing, weapons, cannons, tools, coins, games, including dice and backgammon, cutlery, food, drinks, and 6 of the 10 original sails. The artifacts and the ship itself have provided scholars with invaluable insights into details of naval warfare, shipbuilding techniques, and the everyday life of 17th century Sweden. From 1961 to 1988, the Vasa was housed in a temporary facility called the Vasa Shipyard, with a building erected over her until a more permanent building could be constructed. Although the Vasa was in surprisingly good condition after spending 333 years at the bottom of the sea, she would have quickly deteriorated if the hull had simply been allowed to dry. The large bulk of oak timber constituted an unprecedented conservation problem. The entire Vasa ship was sprayed with polyethylene glycol for 17 years, followed by a long period of slow drying, which was not completed entirely until 2011. The Vasa Museum officially opened to the public in 1990 and is today the world's best preserved 17th century ship, as well as is the most visited museum in Scandinavia. Alright everybody, that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed this footage. I really enjoyed going to the Vasa Museum and had a great time putting this together for you. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you another day in another video.